Hello everybody and welcome back to the chassis variant series of myself, Critical Rocket, yes. And today we're on to our next 100 tonner after the King Crabs, the Annihilator. Now the Annihilator is an interesting assault mech that made its debut in the Innisphere back in the sort of very tail end of the Amaris Civil War. It was largely unseen within the Innisphere, virtually unseen, maybe I would say literally a handful of examples of this mech may have remained in the Innisphere until the Dragoons returned from the clan space, obviously posing as Innisphere mercenaries. They were the ones who basically reintroduced the mech into circulation within the Innisphere, and again, even then, they were the only ones who used it. But it was largely used by the clans, the burgeoning clans and the Star League Exile for a long time. It was used primarily as a defensive fixed position mech due to its very low speed, 32 kph as standard. Meant that the mech wasn't going to be chasing anything around. It preferred its prey to come to it, and then it would tear it apart with its weaponry. So we're looking at the 1A, I believe, and this variant is the one that apparently turned up with the Dragoons in the Innisphere, which meant it didn't have the LB10s that are seen as the standard model from the 2A. So this had 4 autocannon 10s and the 4 medium lasers, which meant it was still incredibly powerful. It could punish any target at medium to short range who decided to stupidly get within the view of the Annihilator. Obviously, it's slightly limited by the fact that it doesn't really have any ranged punch, but as I said, because the mech was designed around the idea of being a city point defense mech, it didn't have to get particularly good sight lines on a target. It just had to wait for them to blunder into its line of sight within dense urban centres, and then it would just tear it a new one. It wasn't the best at melee combat due to the fact that it didn't really have any hands, but it could kick pretty well, and if a pilot could somehow get up enough steam out of it, it probably could barge a target out of the way or knock over smaller mechs with its sheer bulk alone. Now, MechWarrior Online, it is a pretty equal mech. It's the most balanced on hardpoints in the Annihilator lineup. It has 5 energy and 5 ballistics hardpoints. The ballistics are split across the arms and the left and right torso, while the energy is split between the arms and the center torso. So it generally means that regardless of what happens to the mech, you've still got a pretty decent spread of weapons across. And does this mean that the mech is good for XL engines? No. I'd say it's a poor choice as a mech for an XL engine. It seems to have a particularly large side torso hitbox. I'm not quite sure why. You'd think the C2 would be the main one, but it isn't, which means it's going to very quickly get downed if you go to the XL route. Light fusion engine does work pretty well instead if you do prefer that route, and you can get an okay speed, but even then it's still not great, around about 48 kph with all of the speed tweak skills unlocked and with a pretty decent engine. I mean, I've run these things with standard 300s, and even with speed tweak you can't break the 50 kph mark. So keep that in mind. The mech is heavily reliant on support from the team, but when you get that support, it's magic. You can brutalise targets at whatever range is comfortable for you with your build, and it's all good from there. On the flip side of it, the Annihilator is also extremely susceptible to being torn apart by enemy lights that might catch you up. Especially if you're trailing at the back of a team that are a bit gung-ho. So keep that in mind. Other issues that I think the Annihilator suffers is that despite the fact that it's so tall, it still suffers from the fact that its ballistics hardpoints are actually quite low mounted, and this is in keeping with the actual visuals of the mech, because if you ever look at an image of the Annihilator, you'll see that the ballistics are quite low down in the side torsos. And the arms are also quite low slung, so it's a mech that relies on having very clear sight lines across a relatively flat terrain. You will have issues making sure all of your shots hit if you're on anything like an incline, on a hillside, or if any kind of terrain really starts to block your view. The mech does also have heat issues if you're trying to run it in any of the stock loadouts, just because it just doesn't have the amount of free space necessary to just whack in loads of heat sinks to keep it going. At least from the stock build perspective. If obviously customized builds, it's a lot more refined. Obviously, you can kind of tweak it however you feel, and for that reason, 5 ballistics and 5 energy is a pretty bloody good setup. Obviously, one of the things that the Annihilators, I think, outside of the hero mech, lacks is any kind of LRM or any kind of missile capability. But it's never really been that kind of mech. It's a weapons platform. It's a ballistics platform mainly. It's party pieces being able to drop a ton of ballistics damage onto something and then backing it. It's also relatively well armed. Even as a stock load, it does come with 12.5 ton of armor, and that can be increased. It's surprising how much armor you can still add to an Annihilator when you get one fresh out the box, so to speak. So it can be extremely resistant. In all, I find the Annihilator to be a very situational mech. It's definitely one of my favourite assaults in BattleTech. I love it visually because it's pretty friggin' ugly, but it's also pretty cool at the same time. And on tabletop it always worked magic when it did get a chance. And I don't know, MechWarrior Online, I wish it could be better. I hope the urban map that's going to be added in the future will really allow this mech to shine. And it definitely deserves it deserves to have, I think, a better setup for it than what we currently have, because it needs some nice maps to really help some of these urban builds really shine. So I hope you enjoyed that. I thought that was a decent match to show off the 1A there, and I hope you all have a good week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!